All right, I'm going to try to appease my ADHD brain on the front part. So when reading Isaiah, just a fun fact, there's a couple today. When reading Isaiah, one of my favorite parts is that he names the wild beasts, the jackals and the ostriches. And jackal is just a fun word to say. But the Hebrew there is tannin for those wild beasts. And a lot of scholars use that to discuss dinosaurs and large reptiles. So if your kid ever asks you, are dinosaurs real? And can you find them in the Bible? Isaiah 43 is where you go to do that. And there is scholarly translation for tannin for some. So I'm helping you, you just don't know it yet. But anyway, so last week we introduced our Advent theme. What do you fear? You all spent time naming fears and the faith and hope that comes with life in the time of Herod. We spent time discussing that fear is not equal to faithlessness. It's often just information or our body's way of telling us that something matters, and that once activated, the body can go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and we threw in follow and a sharing time bonus of flock. This week, as we turn towards the second week in the season of hope and expectation, we continue with the child of Elizabeth and Zechariah, John the Baptist. Born after a period of God's silence where people were navigating life, wondering, and I believe asking the question that we ask today, is it all in vain? That question grows out of fear too. Fear that our hope and our work that we poured ourselves into will not amount to much. Fear that our hope is dangling by an ornamental thread. Fear that God might be moving, but not in our direction. Fear that our faithfulness might outlast our capacity to see change. But Advent doesn't ask us to clean that up or tidy up that fear. This year, we're being invited to be honest about them and to bring them into the light of this season. From this pulpit or lectern or whatever we're calling it today, I've talked a lot about my childhood and growing up. One of the things that I have shared is I don't have many childhood memories. And the ones I do have are often the trauma ones. But one thing I've experienced since being pastor here and preaching so frequently is sometimes I get the glimpses of the good ones. And sometimes the neutral ones, just because I don't want to live in the binary of good and bad, but whatever. This week, it happened again. When I was younger, my grandmother would clean the house on the weekends or cook gigantic pots of goulash or pinto beans, gross, or like what. I'll eat them now, but not without internal pain. But like she would just make pots of things. And now I think about it, she was feeding a lot of people. But it would be like, what in the world? Who is coming over here? But anyway, we would listen to gospel. One of the songs came back to my mind, and it was by the Clark sisters. It came out in 1979, the year I was born. Of course, I don't remember hearing it that year, but when I did hear it, the song was called, "Is My Living in Vain?" The song asks, is my living in vain? Is my giving in vain? Is my praying in vain? Even as a child, I knew those were big questions. Now, I may not have went through a whole lot by like 6, but I knew something was big about it, and I knew it felt heavy. Fast forward to 1993. Yes, the 1900s, my freshman year of high school. A group named Escape brought that song back for a new generation as the last song on their Hummin' Comin' At Ya album. By then I was older, and Lord, thought I had went through something then. Yeesh. But it felt different. Hearing these girls dressed in black leather pants and combat boots looking like me, saying the same things hit different. You see, I had experienced some stuff. I had known disappointment and trials and what it meant to pray and experience what I felt like was silence. I knew what it was to protest without progress, to love people who still chose harm, and to hold on to hope with trembling and shaking hands. When Escape remade the song, I still knew the questions were heavy, but this time I had my own fears echoed back at me. Do I matter? Does my effort matter? The Clark sisters and Escape answered the question in the song, and I'll give it to you now so you're not stressed out wondering how this all ends. No, of course not. But I admit, when it gets to that part after all that in vain questioning, it doesn't feel quite like a triumphant declaration all the time. Sometimes it's a little fragile promise that I choose to believe even when everything around it says otherwise. It is that question, is it all in vain, that brings me to John the Baptist. In Matthew 11, John is sitting in prison. Fear is no stranger to him. He is a prophet who has spent his entire ministry preparing a way for a Messiah he has not fully seen yet. Last week, in the time of Herod, we were confronted with Herod the Great, the oldest Herod. Matthew 11's is a different one. Different guy, same empire. Interesting fact, there were a bunch of Herods. The New Testament writers just put them all together so you wouldn't be as confused. And I'm going to tell you why and confuse you. I had to go through it, you go through it. We are a team. So Herod the Great is who we encountered last week. He had 3 sons that he divided his kingdom into: Herod Antipas, Herod Archelaus, and Herod Philip, or Philippe. I really be wanting to call him Philippe, but that sounds so French and fun, and he wasn't a really good guy, so I feel like he gets Philip. Like, he might even get Philp. Like, I might even just start messing it up even more. But he does not get to be a Philippe, because that has too much whimsy. So, Herod Philip. And if you are named Philip or hear this and ain't Philip, I'm sure you're a really nice guy. But he also had great-grandsons, Herod Agrippa and Herod Agrippa II, all of whom we encounter in the New Testament. In Matthew 11, John is imprisoned by Herod Antipas. Up to that point, he had done all he'd been asked to do. He was in the wilderness, preaching, doing baptisms, dunking, speaking truth to empire, but he made folks mad. We found out what got him sent to jail in chapter 14, but bear with me, this family tree is inappropriate and a hot mess. Antipas wanted to take the wife of his half-brother, Philip. She was also Antipas's niece, so he wanted to marry his niece and brother-in-law's, his stepbrother or half-brother's wife. When this happened, the kingdom was upset. They were irritated. This caused controversy, and John spoke out, referencing the Deuteronomic law that said you can't marry your brother's wife. Very clearly in Leviticus. I wonder what was happening that they had to put that in there, but it is there and clear. This angered both Herod and Herodias, that's the girl, who would become his wife, and ultimately later on is the reason that John was killed. She asked for his head as her last bitter thing. But now the man who heralded liberation is held captive by this empire he challenged. This is a man who did everything God asked of him from the time of his birth, but he still ends up in the prison industrial complex. He ends up incarcerated. While in captivity, John is hearing all of these things that Jesus is doing and sends his disciples with a message. Are you that guy? Are you this somebody? Will you be the one? This is a question born from the same spiritual DNA as is my living in vain, and have I done enough? It is the question you ask when the promises of God feel distant and your reality feels like a closed door. It is the question when your hope slips, when fear grows loud, and you wonder, is it all really true from whatever cell you feel trapped in? In chapter 3, John had baptized Jesus, and he was there when the voice of God said, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." But now from this prison walls, he begins to have doubts, to fear the work he had started, the purpose he had lived into. Was it truly going to come to pass? Will the oppressed be set free? Would my people know freedom? Is this that guy? John's disciples find Jesus and shares John's question, and Jesus responds by listening and telling them, "Go tell him what you've seen. The blind have received their sight, the lame walk, those with the skin disease are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor have good news brought to them." What a list. Healing, restoration, and we've talked about this before. Miracles were not performed forever. People still died. But the place of the miracle was to bring people off the margins and back into community. But there's something missing. Jesus does not include, and the captives were set free. Even though that is part of what we now know as prophetic expectation, it was not a detail lost on John or on us. I imagine John was waiting for a miracle that we know he never received. In that space, being left out of promise, fear of being forgotten, fear of having run this race without making it to the finish line. And yet, Jesus affirms John. Jesus honors his ministry. Jesus names him, and not in this translation, not in the CSB, but in the NRSV, Jesus names him as one of the greatest ever born of a woman. Jesus does not dismiss John's fear or beat him down for his doubt or what could be called unbelief. Jesus situates John's story within a larger mosaic. John is a piece of the puzzle with no expectation to be the whole picture. His work is embedded in a divine story that unfolds beyond the limits of even what John can see. And it matters to name out loud here that John himself was never the expected version of embodied hope. Even Jesus says, "What did you come to see?" He didn't look like what people thought a prophet should look like. He didn't come dressed in temple authority or position in places of comfort. He came out the wilderness. The literal got it out the mud. He was strange, loud, disruptive. I feel like I'm looking in the mirror. Disruptive. It didn't read like that when I was typing it. I'm like, interesting. Add that to my email signature, John the Baptist. But he was strange, loud, and disruptive, unapologetically himself, and that very difference was part and the heart of his calling. I know what that's like. There are days when I know I am an unexpected vessel. When my embodiment, my leadership, the timbre of my voice, my gender, my blackness, these sneakers, my queerness, my fatness, whatever part of me that carries holy fire is treated like something to question. It's used to disqualify me rather than to honor or encourage. It reminded me yesterday, wait a minute, I have to pick my tangent, hold on, okay. It reminded me yesterday of, there is a book, it's a play called For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide, When the Rainbow Is Enough. It is by Ntozake Shange. And there's a poem in it. There's a dialogue in it. It's a woman in yellow, a woman in brown, a woman in red, a woman in blue, and they're dialoguing through this whole play. Don't watch the movie, it's too much. You reading it is a bit better, but there's a part when the characters are dialoguing and they say, "But being alive and being a woman and being colored is a metaphysical dilemma I haven't conquered yet. My love is too delicate to have thrown back in my face. My love is too delicate to have thrown back on my face. My love is too beautiful to have thrown back on my face. My love is too sanctified to have thrown back on my face. My love is too magic to have thrown back on my face. My love is too Saturday night to have thrown back on my face. My love is too complicated to have thrown back on my face. My love is too music to have thrown back on my face. Those words name a truth that many of us carry in our bones, that the world often struggles to recognize the holiness of who we are. And yet Jesus recognizes John. Wild, strained, rough around the edges, John. Which means that those of us who have felt too complicated, too magic, too Saturday night, too music, too much of anything or anyone are not disqualified from hope, but are very often the ones who carry it most clearly. This is where I believe the text turns towards us. Some of us carry those fears that our efforts don't matter. We fear that the world is unmoved by our prayers, that justice is unmoved by our protests, that healing is unmoved by our tears. We fear that the work we do in this corner of the world is too little, too late. Like John, many of us do not get to see the outcome we long for. And like John, we wonder if that is the promise, or if the promise is still coming, even when it doesn't come in the way we hoped. This feeling is not isolated to just us in our modern society, nor was it unique to the New Testament. Isaiah speaks into his own community struggle in the Hebrew Bible. These words from God, "I am about to do a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" Were first spoken to a people who had known exile, devastation, and disorientation. God was reminding them that despair was not the end of their story, that even in rubble, divine creativity was still building. As Christians, it's important for us not to approach this through replacement theology. We don't take Isaiah's promise as if it were written about Jesus or instead of to the Jews. Rather, we receive it as a witness to the thread of God's character. The same God who has always made a way where there was none, who has always brought life out of places that looked barren, who has always surprised God's people with restoration, especially when they least expected it. Jesus doesn't fulfill Isaiah by erasing its original meaning. Jesus echoes a God who has always brought newness into our human experience. When we hear Isaiah's words alongside John's story, we are remembering that God has been making new things across generations, across covenants, across communities, and that fear has never been able to stop God's movement. Isaiah widens and broadens our scope. He invites us to remember that even when we cannot see the shift or when it's not shifting the way we thought, it's still underway. Hope is indeed afloat. In August, Chris Scott, pastor of the Exchange, a Mennonite church in Winchester, Virginia, wrote a column in Anabaptist World. In it, he says, there is something defiant about hope, something foolish, something sacred. Hope in this sense is not certainty, it is perception. This kind of hope is a flicker of light in the corner of your eye. It's the courage to believe that the small, steady light still shining in the darkness, it's not random. It is divine revelation. Hope is not the absence of fear. It is what happens when we let a greater truth speak in the presence of it. So I ask of you, if your fear this week sounds like John's, you are not alone in asking, are you that guy? If your fear echoes the Clark sisters, is my living in vain, you are in good company. The story of Advent tells us that God is moving in ways we sometimes cannot perceive until later. The story of John tells us that we have a part in God's work, even when we can't see the end of the road. And the music that shapes so many of our experiences reminds us that some truths must be sung again and again until you believe them. Fear does not mean the story is a failure. Fear means you are awake to the weight of what matters. Fear means you care. Fear is the sign that your spirit recognizes the gravity of your calling. And the answer to the question, is it all in vain, is still the same. No, of course not. Because even in the places where we feel confined, the moments where our perception is dim, even when the miracle we long for does not reach us personally, God is doing a new thing. And that new includes you. Our work, our witness, our prayers, our hopes, they are not wasted. Not one bit of it has been or is in vain. The word of God for the people of God.